Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Landheis. I am the director of the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. I believe many of you are just having trouble with Mackenzie's mic. Hopefully you can all hear me pretty well, as I think it was just a difficulty with hers, but please let us know in the chat. Thank you all for joining us. We're doing this webinar in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. SPARK is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance across the country on the issue of stalking. We are grateful for their funding. This is just the caveat that they have approved the slides, but they're not responsible for the words that we say today. I would encourage all of you to check out our website, which is stalkingawareness.org, if you are not familiar with the work that SPARK does. We have practitioner guides and training modules and victim resources available on our website that you are welcome to access. And most of the resources that we provide are available in both English and in Spanish. So please check those out. And Emma, who is my colleague at SPARK, will be linking some of the resources that we talk about today in the chat. So feel free to check those out. So today we're actually going to spend time talking about the connection between stalking and intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And we want to start off by defining what stalking is. And we're going to use the behavioral definition today rather than your state statutes, because we have over 200 people who are on the webinar with us today. And the definition that we are actually going to use is that stalking is a pattern of behavior that is directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or the safety of someone else, or suffer substantial emotional distress. If you've attended a SPARK webinar before, that definition is familiar to you. And depending on what type of work you do, it may be familiar because it is part of your state statute or because it is part of Department of Education regulations. But I want to take just a second to break that definition down. So if we say that something is a pattern of behavior, how many incidents are we looking for? And Jason, I'm going to answer your question in just a second. If stalking is a pattern of behavior, yeah. So several of you are putting in the chat that typically requires 2 or more incidents. Now, some of you may live in a state that dictates how many incidents have to occur to meet the criminal definition of stalking, but behaviorally, we typically say 2 or more incidents. We also say that it would be directed at a specific person. Keep in mind that we know stalking oftentimes spills over to other people besides the primary victim. That might be friends or family members, coworkers, pretty much anyone the victim would have an emotional tie to. And then it says it would cause either fear or emotional distress. Now, to answer the question that was in the chat, someone said, is emotional distress required? Depending on how the state statute is written, typically it says fear or emotional distress. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the feelings of emotional distress and fear are very subjective. And what might be fear-inducing to one person might not be fear-inducing to another person. So I want to give you an example, and I want to ask how many of you would, and you don't have to answer in the chat, but just to yourself, how many of you would admit to being afraid of spiders? I'm guessing some of you raised your hand. Yeah. So I want to show you a video and see if you would react like the female in this video, or if you would react like the male in this particular video. So that video buffered, which sometimes happens on Zoom. So we're going to play it again. Okay, How many of you are reacting like the female and you're jumping on the back of the couch, burning the house down with fire? Okay, a couple of you. Yeah, some of you are already saying, nope, I'm going to react like the male in this particular video. Some of you might even look at the female's reaction and say, perhaps the victim overreacted a little bit. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is if I changed this particular scenario and I told you that woman had been bitten by a black widow spider before, many of you would say, now I get why she reacted that way. And maybe it's not an overreaction anymore, simply by giving you some of the context in that particular case. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind why victims feel that particular way. One of the things that we know happens oftentimes in stalking cases is that there is something that happens that is frightening and fear-inducing to a victim, but not to the rest of us. And oftentimes the specific behaviors that happen in stalking cases mean something to the victim because of a past relationship, because of past behaviors that the offender has engaged in, but otherwise to the rest of us, we're not really sure why they would be fear-inducing or cause some type of emotional distress. And the other thing that makes stalking crimes really difficult, especially when we look at the criminal aspect, is that stalking essentially criminalizes non-criminal events. It is not illegal to send somebody a text message, show up at a baseball game, or drive down a public street. Now, it might become so when we look at it within the context of a stalking crime, but on face value, oftentimes those individual incidents that happen in stalking crimes are not criminal in and of themselves, which can create some barriers in stalking cases when, as a civil and as a criminal system, we have a tendency to be very incident-based. We are oftentimes looking at one particular thing that has happened and trying to fit it into our state statute or trying to figure out what exactly we are being presented with. And in stalking crimes, it requires us to go below the surface and look at the entirety of what's going on in these particular situations. And that's not always easy, especially as many of us are under-resourced, understaffed, underfunded. So keep in mind that as we talk about these particular situations, especially in intimate partner stalking situations, the context is really critical. And there is oftentimes things that happen that the victim assigns meaning to that doesn't necessarily mean anything to the rest of us. Keep in mind too, that not only is fear subjective, but that oftentimes the emotional distress part of our definition is expressed as anger, frustration, sometimes apathy, depending on the situation. And that oftentimes people expect victims in stalking situations to express overt fear, to be crying, to be shaking. And instead, we're met with somebody who's really mad. They're mad that no one's listening to them. They're mad that the offender won't leave them alone. They're mad that nothing is happening in these particular situations. So keep in mind as we look at especially intimate partner stalking situations, that this context is extremely critical to understanding the big picture. And that big picture is necessary not only to build accountability for offenders, but to enhance the safety of the victims that we're working with. It's also important to consider what criminal avenues we have for accountability in stalking cases as well. So we certainly know that every single state has a stalking statute. They're all defined differently. They're all outlined differently. There are different components to them. Most of them contain at least a portion of the behavioral definition that we already went over. It's also important to consider that many tribes have codes that address stalking, and there is the federal level of stalking as well, which happens when that stalking has occurred either across state lines, so the offender has crossed the state lines, the communication has crossed the state lines, or in and out of tribal territory also can create a federal crime. And then if you have an individual, either the victim or the offender who is enrolled in the military, you also have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which can dictate repercussions and sentencing, et cetera, that happens if cases involve somebody who's military involved. So just aspects to think about as we look at these particular cases. I'm curious how many of you, especially since it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, how many of you work with as many victims of stalking as you work with victims of domestic violence? How many of you have a caseload that is even for the number of victims of domestic violence and the number of victims of stalking? Couple people raising their hands, and that's it. I'm going to guess most of you are working on cases that involve domestic violence more frequently than you might be working on cases that involve stalking. And I'm always a little curious about that. But one of the things that we know is that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking at some point in their lifetime. And those rates are just as high as the rates of domestic violence. So why do we think it is that we are not working with as many victims of stalking as we might be victims of domestic violence? Why do we think our caseloads aren't as even? So somebody suggested that people don't think they will be believed, that it's not reported, that it might be normalized. What do the rest of you think? Some people are saying that because it involves that pattern, it might be a little bit harder. That sometimes as a system, we might not be recognizing it, that it might be harder to prove. Yeah. Or that, as we're going to bring up, it might be considered under what somebody said is the umbrella of domestic violence situations. Yeah, someone also mentioned, and I appreciate it, the fact that many of our funding sources target domestic violence and sexual assault. And so some people might believe that their funding doesn't cover working with stalking victims if they're not in an intimate partner situation. Yeah, so the theme in the chat, if you are all following along, really tends to focus on the fact that most people are saying either the victim's not recognizing that it's happening within the context of domestic violence and being lumped together with the domestic violence, or that maybe as responders, we're not doing a really great job either, and that's affecting reporting rates. I would tell you all of the things that you brought up are true. I also want to take just a moment to say that the research and the statistics on stalking are emerging. They're not always as up to date as we would like them to be. And so while this particular screen reflects the reality of people who self-identified as women and men, this particular study did not give the ability for individuals to identify as binary or gender nonconforming. We do know that the rates within the non-binary and gender nonconforming community are much higher than the rates that you see on your screen. But I wanted to point out that's why it's not reflected in this particular slide, not because we don't think it's important when it does happen within the community. So please be aware of that in this particular slide, and that this slide is reflecting what victims are disclosing as their experience. This is not the number of individuals who are making a report, say, for instance, to the criminal justice system. And we all know that reporting rates could be a 5-hour-long webinar where we're all discussing all the different situations that might affect reporting rates, but just something to be thinking about as we're looking at this particular situation. The other thing that I want to point out to you is the difference in rates amongst different racial and ethnic groups. And we know that this particular report highlights within the United States that our American Indian and Alaska Native individuals experience stalking at much higher rates than their white counterparts, and that individuals who identify as multiracial are experiencing some of the highest rates of stalking. And again, these are self-reported rates. Given those high prevalence rates and the fact that many of you said, I don't have as full of a stalking caseload as I have a domestic violence caseload, we've already generated some reasons why we think that is. And we have said it's probably because people aren't identifying it, either victims or responders, that they don't feel like there's any point in reporting it, or that they might not know where to report to. So we're going to talk about some of those things in the rest of our time together. What I do want to point out is that many of you already in the chat said we're working with domestic violence victims, and many of those domestic violence victims are also experiencing stalking. Across the country, the response to stalking has been seated in our response to domestic violence. For community-based advocacy centers, there is no standalone stalking center across the US. Most of those centers are domestic violence and sexual assault community-based programs that are providing services to victims of stalking, but sometimes only to intimate partner victims of stalking. If you look at the criminal justice response to stalking, a lot of times people will say, we have a great criminal justice response in our community. And then they identify that if stalking has been identified in a case, that perhaps a family violence detective or somebody in a domestic violence unit is the person who's investigating that case. And the question stands then, what if somebody is being stalked? Stalking cases involve a perpetrator who is not a current or former intimate partner. And so that calls into question, how are we working with those victims? Are they eligible for shelter? Would their case be investigated by somebody who has specialized knowledge on the issue of stalking if it came in, say, for instance, as a slashed tires case? Would somebody identify that it's not a property crime, it's actually a stalking case? Now for today, obviously, we're going to focus on about half of the cases that have to do with current or former intimate partners. And so we're going to spend some time identifying what special risks exist in those particular cases. And we're going to also highlight some of those particular dynamics. Now, it's important to remember that women are more likely to experience stalking than men, and that a majority of victims, regardless of their sexual orientation, report that the offender is male. So keep in mind that when you have a male victim of stalking, in half the time, you have another male who is stalking them. And the other half the time, it's a female. We also know that a majority of victims know their offender in some capacity, clearly that current or former intimate partner that we talked about, and that the highest rates of stalking happen within the 18 to 24-year-old age group. For lots of different reasons, but primarily because that particular age group is engaging in romantic relationships. They're trying to figure out what relationships look like. And there is oftentimes stalking that is happening within those particular situations. Lots of people want to say the higher rates happen within that particular age group because of social media, but we know certainly social media enhances offenders' ability, but it doesn't cause the stalking. Things to think about as we spend some more time together. One of the questions that we oftentimes get when it comes to stalking is, Why do stalkers stalk? What's their motivation? And currently we know that some are stalking because they're seeking affection from somebody else. So they're trying to engage in a relationship, or they've been rejected. And as part of that rejection, they're now stalking that person. But many individuals are stalking out of those power and control dynamics, those same dynamics that we see happen in intimate partner violence. But it's also important to keep in mind that some stalkers are stalking because they're planning to commit a crime, and that crime is typically sexual assault. And some stalkers are stalking simply because they can, because there has not been accountability for them. Individuals who work on investigating stalking cases can oftentimes tell you that they will work a case and then the victim is able to get away from the stalker, or that particular stalking situation ends, but then the stalker starts stalking someone else. It's their mode of operation. That's how they are often interacting with other people. So things to think about. But I want to go back to what many of you mentioned earlier in the chat, where you said, I think we're probably not seeing stalking situations as often because people aren't identifying what's happening to them as stalking. And I completely agree with you. Most people identify stalking behaviors as behaviors where someone is following or surveilling or monitoring someone else's activity, either in person or virtually. But we know that stalking is more than that. And just like many of you have had the experience of learning about the power and control wheel, which was developed where people identified all the different behaviors that happen in domestic violence situations, there has also been a framework that has been developed to try to describe all the behaviors that happen in stalking situations. This particular framework is what we refer to as the SLY framework. And it stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference through some kind of sabotage or attack, and intimidation factors. Now, typically, if a victim identifies that's what is happening to them is a stalking situation, it's typically because there has been surveillance behavior that has been occurring, where the offender has been following or monitoring the victim. They might use some kind of tracking software. They oftentimes will wait someplace where they know the victim is likely to show up, their gym, their place of work, kids' school, or they're obtaining information about the victim either online or in person, or they're engaging in proxy stalking, which is where you use a third party to stalk someone else. Now, what we know is that when victims experience this behavior, they're a little bit more likely to identify that they're experiencing stalking. And as a response system, we are a little bit more likely to identify that this is a stalking case. If a case involves this type of behavior, we're more likely to see it end up in the court system. But what is also happening are the other pieces of that framework. For example, the life invasion. The life invasion happens when the offender is inserting themselves into the private sphere of the victim's life. So either virtually or in person. So they're making unwanted contact at the victim's home, at their place of work. They're harassing the victim's friends and family members. Sometimes that happens because they've been court ordered away from the victim. And so they start targeting someone close to the victim. Oftentimes, life invasion involves some kind of property crime. We see lots of vandalism cases tied to stalking cases where perhaps the stalking wasn't identified and it was being chalked up as North Carolina recently, just last week. And we were training a police department, And one of the questions I asked them was, are you working with as many non-intimate partner stalking cases? And they said, no. And I said, I'm curious why you think that is. As a result of our conversation, the detective that was hosting the training emailed us a couple of days later and said, I went back through some of our calls for service where victims are calling police for assistance. And I found a couple of them that made me think, you know what, this might be a stalking situation. One of them was a neighbor situation where the calls for service were being logged as trespassing calls or criminal mischief. And the detective called the victim back and had a conversation with that victim. And it turns out it was a stalking situation, but it had been treated like a property crime because of the relationship between the victim and the offender. They were neighbors. It didn't get identified as a stalking situation. We also see situations that involve some kind of interference through sabotage or attack, where the offender might be interfering with custody. They might engage in road rage or sabotage of victims' work or finances, ruin their credit. Emma from our office is linking a couple of documents in the chat for you that those of you who are law enforcement, or even if you aren't, can use to identify stalking behaviors on calls for service or on interactions with victims if they say, for instance, call your hotline. The last category of the SLY framework is intimidation, where the offender is threatening the victim, where they're engaging maybe in symbolic violence. Now, symbolic violence is something that happens that means something to the victim, but not to the offender. I'll give you a perfect example. Early on in my career, I was in dispatch when a victim called law enforcement for assistance, and she was crying. And what she stated through her tears was that somebody had left a cup of coffee inside of her car. And at first, dispatch was rolling their eyes at me. Really? It's a cup of coffee. And I said, ask her what that means to her. And she said, he's here. And what had happened is she had gone out to her locked vehicle, and inside of her locked vehicle is a Starbucks coffee cup with the coffee made the exact way that she typically orders it. It was still warm. And on the coffee cup was the pet name that her offender used to call her. And she had fled across the state away from her ex-husband and had relocated, thought he didn't know where she had relocated to, and she had come out to her locked vehicle to find that cup of coffee inside the car. Now, certainly that meant much more to that victim than a simple cup of coffee, but we had to go beyond that initial report and that call to dispatch to figure out exactly what was happening in those particular situations. So keep in mind that oftentimes we are given one little piece of information and there's a whole lot of context that we have to dig to find. Now, in these particular situations, this particular SLY framework can be incredibly useful for recognizing those patterns. As Marion had just asked in the chat, do we have some information about recognizing these patterns? I would recommend using this particular SLY framework. And this SLY framework, as Emma had linked, is available for law enforcement and it's linked as a tool on a lot of the different practitioner sections of our website. So if you go to our website, thestalkingawareness.org, there's a lot of tools on there that you can use that describe this particular SLY framework. And where it's really helpful is a lot of times when we screen for stalking, say within the context of domestic violence, or we're asking questions about stalking to try to be able to provide services or look at accountability, what we have to keep in mind is simply asking victims, has there been other harassing behavior? Is the offender stalking you? Many of us use that as our question to inquire about stalking. And unfortunately, That's a really bad question. Because what we know is victims don't identify a lot of the behaviors that you see on the SLY framework as stalking behaviors. And many times they won't bring up these things if they're applying for a civil protection order, if we're looking at safety planning, if they're making a report to law enforcement, because they don't identify this stuff as stalking. And it isn't until we're describing these particular things and saying, has this person damaged your property? Have they been monitoring your social media? Have they shown up at your gym? And victims say, oh, yeah, all that's been happening. But they didn't identify it as stalking. And so that particular framework can be incredibly helpful for identifying the range of behaviors that's happening in stalking cases. And if you are trying to prove a crime and safety plan around a course of conduct, you have to understand and identify what that course of conduct is. And you can't simply ask, has there been other stalking or harassing behaviors? You have to describe the behaviors. And many times people will get frustrated and say, why did victims not bring this up earlier? Why did they not mention it in their police report? Why did they not bring it up in their civil protection order hearing? And when victims are asked that question, they say, because you didn't ask the right question. You asked me if I was being stalked. I didn't know what that was. This particular framework can be incredibly helpful, especially as you're working on intimate partner violence situations, to screen for and identify if there's also stalking that's happening within the context of intimate partner violence. What we have to keep in mind in these particular situations is many stalkers are using more than one means of approach. If they are suddenly prohibited from telephoning, contacting, or communicating the victim, provisions of most civil protection orders, then they do things like show up at Walmart, or they ask a mutual friend what the victim's been up to. They try to change their means of approach to see what kind of information they can gather and how they can target the victim in another way. So the SLY framework can also be incredibly helpful when you're trying to safety plan. So if you've safety planned about the offender showing up at the victim's place of employment, then the SLY framework can also help figure out what are some of the other tactics that the offender might do. So let's delve more deeply into that connection between stalking and intimate partner violence. One of the things that we have to be thinking about is that power and control wheel that I mentioned earlier. And if you have had the opportunity to be trained on domestic violence or have spent any time doing domestic violence work, this power and control wheel is probably pretty familiar to you. It was developed decades ago to describe all the different things that happen in domestic violence situations, because typically people were focused on physical and sexual violence, and we weren't necessarily addressing all the other things that happen in domestic violence situations. Things like emotional abuse or intimidation, or the offender coercing or threatening the victim. And what typically happens, as many of you mentioned in the chat, when stalking happens within the context of intimate partner violence, it's typically chalked up to part of the power and control. If we have a domestic violence offender who is monitoring the victim's actions, who's really jealous, who's very controlling, who doesn't allow the victim to have a job, who's looking at their social media, when that stuff's happening, people typically just say, that's part of domestic violence situations. That's what we know happens in domestic violence situations. And oftentimes it isn't labeled as stalking behavior until the victim leaves the offender. And then if the victim goes into shelter or separates from the offender, and the offender is showing up someplace and they're monitoring the victim's behavior and they're looking at their phone, et cetera, then people say, oh, now it's stalking. It was stalking when it was happening within the context of intimate partner violence, We just didn't call it that. We just said, oh, that's part of the power and control that happens in domestic violence situations. But is it also not a pattern of behavior that's directed at someone that would cause them to experience fear or emotional distress? It absolutely is. And some of you might be thinking, does it really matter if we call it domestic violence or if we call it stalking? And it does matter for a couple of reasons. Number one, our intimate partner stalkers are our most dangerous. They are the ones who are more likely to physically approach the victim. They know the background and history, so they are oftentimes more interfering, more insulting, more threatening to the victim. They oftentimes escalate their situation very quickly, and they're the ones that are more likely to use weapons and to reoffend. People always say, Jennifer, in civil protection orders, if somebody gets a civil protection order, would it really help a stalking case? We know that in interventions like that, in about half of the time, the stalking stops. And half of the time, it doesn't stop. And the times it usually doesn't stop are in intimate partner stalking situations, because the offender feels a sense of entitlement to be doing what they're doing. It's an extension and part of their domestic violence behaviors. It also matters that we identify stalking because we know that stalking is a risk factor for intimate partner homicide. We know that in 85% of attempted and 76% of completed intimate partner femicides, where a male murders a female intimate partner, there has been an episode of stalking within a year prior to the murder. But if we never identified it as stalking, if we didn't charge it as stalking, if we didn't safety plan around the stalking, then we miss the opportunity to potentially stop a homicide. Many of you have probably had training on intimate partner lethality. You've gone to trainings where you've talked about risk factors in domestic violence situations. Perhaps your jurisdiction uses some kind of tool like the lethality assessment protocol or the danger assessment, all of which are excellent tools for identifying risk in intimate partner violence. What we also need to keep in mind is identifying stalking as part of that behavior is also strategic to identifying lethality risks in domestic violence situations. Because if you have an offender who is engaging in domestic violence and stalking, that victim is in 3 times greater danger of being killed by that offender if there's domestic violence plus stalking, because stalking is the number 8 risk factor in intimate partner homicide. Now, this study is what we call a meta-analysis. And if you were not good at research methods like me, it simply means they pulled a bunch of studies on intimate partner homicide, and they put them all together, and they came up with a list of the top 10 lethality factors. So things that many of you are familiar with, like access to weapons, a gun in the home, etc. But stalking is the number 8 risk factor, and it's oftentimes not identified as being a risk factor. And as a system, we have a tendency to not necessarily identify the stalking as part of the situation, and therefore we don't identify the increased risk to the victims that we're working with. Now, I would argue, as I looked at this particular list, that number 9, probably number 5, number 2, those are probably all stalking behaviors as well. So might even have an even higher risk of lethality in these particular situations. Now, given all that information, I'm curious what you all are thinking, because all of a sudden the chat is very quiet. Things you already knew, new information. And for those of you that are raising your hand, we can't unmute just because there's 300 of you on here. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. I'll give a couple of you a chance to put stuff in there. I'll definitely go back to it. So some of you might already be a step ahead of me thinking, okay, you said we can't just say, is stalking been happening? And you said we should think about the prevalence of stalking within these particular situations. These are some ways that you can look for stalking and screen for stalking, especially within intimate partner violence situations. So asking questions like, has the offender been following or monitoring the victim? Have they invaded the victim's life or privacy by making unwanted contact? Have they directly interfered with the victim's life through sexual assault, through keeping the victim from leaving, holding them against their will, making them have an accident? Or have they on more than one time intimidated or scared the victim through some kind of threats or property damage or threatening pets, etc.? Now, as you think about your domestic violence caseload and you look at the 4 questions in front of you, how many of the individuals that you are working with in domestic violence situations would identify that at least one of these questions is happening in their situation? Yeah. Almost all of them. Yeah. So chances are, as most of you already intuitively knew, stalking is probably happening within the context of domestic violence. Perhaps we're just not calling it that. Any questions on those particular screening questions? And we will absolutely link a PDF of this presentation at the end of the webinar today so that you can have access to it. Yeah. And many of you are saying pretty much all of your. Yeah, somebody said, is it fair to say that we think pretty much every domestic violence case has stalking as a factor? Probably. It's just whether we're calling it that, right? Yeah. Yeah, no. Someone asked the question, so tracking, following, and monitoring are not strictly required. No, you could have nothing from the surveillance category and still have things from the life invasion, intimidation, and interference category, and it would still be a stalking situation. Most people think of the tracking, following, monitoring, the surveillance category as the only part of stalking, and stalking is much more than that. Just like we know domestic violence is much more than the physical and sexual violence. Great question, Nina. So for those of you that have been doing risk assessment in domestic violence cases, perhaps you're using the lethality assessment protocol, the LAP, or the danger assessment. We would also encourage you to start using risk assessment in stalking cases. And there is a free online stalking assessment that Emma has linked in the chat for you. And it's called SHARP, and it stands for the Stalking, Harassment, and Risk Profile. And you can find it 2 places, either at coercivecontrol.org or at stalkingrisk.com. You can also find it linked on the SPARC website because we link to it as well. Now, keep in mind that victims are the best predictors of risk in their situations. And so if you have a victim that you're working with who is fearful that this person is going to harm them, you need to listen to them, regardless of what the tool shows you as the outcome of that risk assessment. So just keep in mind, victims are the experts in their own lives. SHARP is really great in that it gives you 2 things. It gives you a narrative report and a risk profile, and it also gives you safety planning suggestions. And what SHARP does is look at 14 different risk factors in stalking situations. It analyzes the course of conduct. So it looks to see if the SLY framework is occurring. It looks to see if there has been an escalation or a potential trigger. Now, keep in mind, if the criminal justice system is involved, chances are there has been an escalation and that there's a potential trigger because the offender is looking at a court date. It also analyzes the nature and the context of the threats in this particular situation and the offender's capability of following through with those threats. It looks to see how persistent the offender has been despite the victim's resistance, what their motive might be, and if they're engaging in proxy stalking, using the third party. It also looks to see if there has been abuse towards the victim or towards other people, if there has been guns or weapons or training that has been part of the situation. So if the offender is military, or say, for instance, law enforcement or former law enforcement, they've had training on the use of those weapons. Is there a criminal history, a mental health history, or substance abuse history on the part of the offender? And how vulnerable is our victim? What's been the impact on their life? Have they been using technology? And how vulnerable is the victim? Great question in the chat already. Somebody's saying, is this tool available in Spanish? It's not at this particular moment in time. The tool was developed by the same researcher, Dr. Logan, out of the University of Kentucky, that the SLY framework was developed. And she developed this tool with no funding. And so that while there have been some talks about translating it, it's much more complicated than just like word for word translation because of the way the assessment's done. Marion, what I could offer to you is we can certainly give you the questions that SHARP asks, and that those could be translated prior to, where we have oftentimes found advocates who are bilingual and working with Spanish speaking individuals will translate it as they're sitting down and doing the assessment with a victim. I wouldn't ever suggest that victims do the assessment by themselves anyway, because if they're doing it by themselves, it can be pretty traumatic. I would always suggest that they're doing it with somebody who can support them at the time that they're doing it. So that might be a workaround, but for now, no, I'm sorry, it's not available in Spanish. Definitely looking at if funding ever becomes available, would love for it to be. So what we're going to do right now is we are going to watch a video and we're going to do a SHARP assessment based on this particular video. So I am going to give you all the heads up that the video can be hard to watch. I want to give you a warning before you watch it. And no, there isn't a shorter version, but Kimberly, you're going to see as we do this together, it takes less than 10 minutes to do the assessment. It's very short, despite what people think, which is why we're doing it together. So we're going to watch this video first. I'm going to stop my own camera just because the video will play better if I do. We're going to watch this. For those of you that are using ASL interpretation, the video is closed captioned.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. In the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From the day she left him, he began stalking her. Calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move.
He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, he was just going to persist with it.
At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, "I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away." Peggy was very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it, wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her, and put her cell phone number on it, and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her haircut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting.
That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks.
Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors.
Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her.
Patrick's behavior was escalating, and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
It was extremely frustrating, and in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. So what we're going to do right now is actually do a risk assessment together, which is always a little tricky because it requires me to share my screen with all of you, etc. So what I'm going to do right now is share the risk assessment screen with all of you. So you should all see the assessment right now. And I'm just going to click right here where it says enter a SHARP assessment. And the first couple of screens are just going to take you through the assessment to let you know that someone's computer could be monitored, that the assessment's 48 questions, and that they estimate it'll take you anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes to do an assessment. You're going to see that it takes even less amount of time than that. What it's also letting you know is once we do the assessment, you're going to get 2 documents that download as a Microsoft Word document. And you would need to save those and print them, attach them, etc. You can't just go back into the computer and find them. So in this type of situation, in Peggy and Patrick's situation, we are assessing a male offender. His name is Patrick. You didn't get his age. I will tell you at the time, he's about 33. Her name, of course, is Peggy. She was, if anyone caught it at the time, 28 years old, and they are related by a ex-partner relationship. You can see here, though, that SHARP can be done to also look at an acquaintance relationship, etc. You can look at this particular situation and assess that this was ex-partner, but you can look at other situations and do other assessments on situations you're working on. So in this case, we're a professional who's answering the question. And we'll just say that we're a domestic violence agency, since that's right at the top, that we are doing this case about a real case, or is it a test? I'm going to say we're testing because I'm using this just for demonstration purposes. This is a real case, yes. And it happened in New Mexico. And the next set of questions say, has Patrick been tracking, following, or monitoring Peggy in any way? Yes, he has. Has he invaded her life or privacy by making unwanted contact with her? Yes. Has he scared, intimidated her through threats, property damage? Yes. Has he significantly and directly interfered with her life, humiliating her, interfering with her finances, etc.? Also, yes. Has he physically or sexually assaulted her while he's been stalking her? We didn't hear anything about that. Has he kept her from leaving or held her against her will? Also, we didn't hear anything about that. Then it's asking us about how long this had been going on. So if this was a current case that we were working on, you hopefully heard that this had been happening for about 3 years. So all I'm going to do is put in a date 3 years ago today, just so you can see how this works. And once I do, it goes on to the next page and will tell me, yeah, about 3 years is the length of this particular case. Then it's asking us, does Patrick regularly contact or harass Peggy in more than one way? Yes. Has he contacted her at more than one location other than through her phone or computer? Yes. Has his behavior increased in frequency or severity? Yes. Now we're just estimating about how many days do you think he's making unwanted contact with her? Most audiences say every day. I'm just going to put 20 down for that. How many days is he directly approaching her? We could say about half that. And how many days is he significantly interfering with her life? And most people say every day. So I'll put 30 for that. I'm just putting numbers in there so you all can see how it shows up in the report. She had broken up with him just once. Has he left objects, made gestures, or said things that felt threatening but weren't direct threats? Absolutely. Has he threatened to physically hurt or kill Peggy? Not at the moment. Has he described in detail how he plans to harm her? Nope. Has he threatened, harassed, stalked, or assaulted others close to her? Yes. Has he threatened to destroy property, harm pets, or sabotage her in other ways? Yes. Has he directly or indirectly threatened her with a gun? Not that we heard. Has he threatened to harm himself? No. Has he made a threat and then did exactly what was threatened? Again, not that we had heard. Has he had other people stalk her? Nope, it was just him at that moment. Have his actions made her afraid or concerned for her safety? And now your choices are not at all, somewhat, or extremely. Most people say extremely. Have they made her concerned for the safety of family members? Extremely. Have they contributed to her making some significant life changes? Extremely. Remember, she was bouncing back and forth. She's changed a lot of things. Does she believe he's capable of harming others close to her? Extremely. And has there been a financial or social impact on her life? Extremely. Remember, she's bouncing from hotel to hotel. Has he been told to stop, either formally or informally? Yes. And has he persisted in contacting her? Yes. Is there some kind of court order in place? Yes. And has he violated the court order? Yes. Has he been controlling, extremely jealous, or physically violent towards Peggy or others in the past? No, yes, suspected, or unknown. Most audiences answer this as suspected because of the sister's comments about her personality changing and that so most people believe that he's been controlling or jealous with her. certainly with others through the flyers and starting Mark's house on fire. We hadn't heard if he's been physically violent with her or other people. Has he ever threatened or used a weapon, strangled her, severely physically assaulted her, sexual assault? We don't know, right? Does he have a criminal history, a drug or alcohol problem, or a serious mental health history? Now, most people are going to say that his behavior wasn't normal, but don't confuse power and control with a mental health history. So we could put suspected or unknown here. I'm going to just put unknown. Has he thought about or attempted suicide in the past? We don't know. Is he obsessed with weapons or have a special military training or law enforcement background? Again, we don't know. Does she believe he's using technology to stalk her? We could put suspected there, because remember the sister said that we thought he was monitoring our phone, and so we didn't want her to call us. Do messages from him suggest he feels rejected, humiliated, or degraded by her? Again, most people say suspected because of the flyers. Does he indicate he wants revenge or blames her for ruining his life? We don't really know, right? Does he seem unconcerned about things like jail or dying? I think most of us would say, yeah, he doesn't seem to be very concerned about that. Any upcoming events that concern her about a potential trigger? Yes, because remember the court date is coming up. Does she feel like she sent him mixed messages? No. Does she think that he's aware that the stuff he's doing bothers her? Yeah. Does she feel bad for him because he's had a bad life? No. Has the behavior previously been reported to the police? Yes, it had been. Does she feel like there's limited or no consequences for his behavior? You definitely got that sense. And is she more vulnerable to the stalking because there's things about the environment that limit her ability to stay safe? And most people say yes. And then you have options like, does she work or go to school at the same place? Is he in a position of authority? They do live, or they did at one point in time live or work near each other. They don't have kids in common. She was in unsafe housing because she was in a hotel. She did have limited access to resources. She is isolated. And she has limited access to safety measures. And huge thanks to our ASL interpreters right now. So we're going through this very quickly. And then we can add anything else here, knowing that any national assessment isn't going to come up with everything that we would want to know. So I'm just very quickly going to add for unique aspects. We could say that there were multiple victims in multiple jurisdictions because we had Mark's house and we had Mom's house, and the cases are pending. He hadn't been arrested yet, so there's no criminal history. We could also say that Patrick is moving around the country to follow her because he's been flying to all these places. And for unique safety aspects, we could say that Peggy is in hiding. I would not put in here that she's staying in motels, because if this would eventually end up in the criminal justice system, then it would have to be given to his attorney or to Patrick, and we don't want to tell him where she's at. And then we finished the assessment. Now it does tell you, hey, if for whatever reason this times out and doesn't work, this is the number that you can use to request your report. Every once in a while, if this assessment doesn't work, it's usually happening on this particular webinar. Yep, because it says I've been inactive too long. What you need to know is I have saved on my computer a risk assessment for this particular situation so that you can see what it looks like. So I'm just looking for that sample right here. So I'm going to share it with you guys in just a second, because that sometimes happens on this webinar, and it's not a fault of the system. It's just because we sit on the webinar for a little while. Okay, so are you all able to see the assessment right now in front of you? Okay, so this is the risk assessment. So you can see that I did this one back in 2019 in a training. I can tell you, I have done this assessment so many times in so many trainings, and it's always within 1 to 2 factors of a result. So just keep in mind that the results are, oh, somebody's saying you can't see it. Okay, thank you. Hold on just a second. Now, can you all see it? Thanks for getting my attention in the chat. Okay. Thank you all for letting me know. I've done webinars where no one told me and I just rattled on for a little while. So thank you all. All right, so this is the assessment that it gives you. And it says we've done this as a professional on behalf of Peggy. She's 28, he's 33, that he's been monitoring her 20 days a month, that the information reported suggests he's stalking her, that they've been in the relationship for X amount of time, that he's been told to stop and the behaviors have been continuing, that he has a history of being controlling and extremely jealous with her and with other people. And then right down here, you can say below is the summary of the 10 serious risk factors that are present in this case. So keep in mind that every time I've done this assessment, it's either come up with 10 or 11 risk factors, depending on how the audience answers these particular questions. It also gives us the opportunity to look at a safety plan and safety steps as well. So the risk assessment gives us the safety plan and the safety steps as well. And I'm going to share that with you now. So here's the safety plan that it comes up with. And it comes up with suggestions for Peggy about taking a good look at everything that has been going on in this particular situation. So seeing what has been happening. It talks about the threats that Patrick has made. And look how long this list of threats is, which might be really useful for, say, for instance, a civil protection order. It talks through how Peggy should consider perhaps keeping evidence in the case and documenting what's been going on, some of the protection options that might be available to her as far as disengaging with Patrick, et cetera. And then it looks at the support systems and it gives referrals to national support systems. What I would do if I were all of you would be to download something like this and then write on there the referrals in your local places where someone could get assistance. If there's a specific officer or a specific victim advocate, et cetera, that you would want Peggy to go visit with. Any questions about that particular assessment while I'm bringing back up the PowerPoint? Okay. So I'm going to give you the heads up and feel free to ask questions in the chat, but I want to show you the results of what happened in this particular case. And I want to warn you that it did not end up with a good outcome and that it can be pretty traumatic because you're about to listen to Peggy call into law enforcement.
And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt that at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself. 6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen? After paying a private investigator for information, Peggy's stalker drove to the Albuquerque airport, checked a handgun and a hunting rifle at the airline counter, and flew to San Jose, California. He retrieved his bag with his weapons, rented a car, and arrived at her neighborhood. He posed as a private investigator, approached a delivery driver who recognized her photo, and gave him her exact address.
He caught up with her on her way out of the house early Saturday morning. He duct taped her hands together, he choked her, and he beat her. He beat her so severely with his gun that her blonde hair turned bright red. Despite all of this, Peggy managed to break free and flee to a neighbor's apartment where she was able to call 911.
911, 911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he said. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it now. Does he have a gun right now? He does. He already beat my head. If you don't get here, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly, my head is stopping wet with blood. He gets in this house, he's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. He ran. Please. Stop. Female. Please stop it. I have to go. Is he kill me? Is he, ma'am?
The SWAT team arrived. Peggy told them, if you open this door, he will kill me.
And the police officer said, let's not talk about that, Peggy. Let's talk about your family. And Peggy had said, tell my mother that I love her. And tell my sister who's pregnant to name the baby after me. And tell my niece, Abby, she will have a guardian angel. And those were Peggy's 3 last requests before she was killed.
I just remember punching a hole in one of my walls, and I started crying, and I just said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to Peggy, because at that point you just feel that I failed her, that the whole system failed her. You just feel powerless.
The doorbell rang. I saw 2 police officers. In that instant, I knew they didn't even have to come into the house because I knew what had happened. I said, just tell me, did Patrick Kennedy kill my sister? And what I was told that night was that he had found Peggy, he had shot her in the head with a gun, and then he had killed himself. I decided, you know what? Knowing Peggy's personality, Peggy would have been on a cell phone at my funeral trying to take action, trying to make something good come out of something so tragic.
Okay, deep breath, because that can be pretty hard to watch. As we indicated, Peggy's story is a true story, and we're going to talk about some of the actions that her sister, Debbie, who you saw at the very end of the video, have done to celebrate Peggy's life and to increase awareness on the issue of stalking. And so we're going to close out our time in a few minutes talking about those particular efforts. To answer a couple of questions that were in the chat as you were watching the video and doing the assessment's being used across the country in various capacities. I would definitely encourage you, if something you're thinking about using in your jurisdiction, to make sure that everybody is familiar with it and on board before you just suddenly introduce it in court or something like that. We do a ton of training on it at Spark. We actually have some recorded webinars on our page that highlight the assessment and go through the assessment, just like you saw me do here. So definitely reach out to us. If you get a copy of the slides in the PDF form that Emma will link at the end of this, the research that is behind the assessment is on that particular slide. So it gives you information. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the impact on individuals who have experienced stalking. And keeping in mind that oftentimes we don't see the same level of urgency in the court system with stalking cases that we might see in domestic and sexual violence cases because of the lack of physical harm. And I usually say, yet. We know that these cases definitely have the potential to escalate, and so they absolutely should be taken with all seriousness. And we know that most victims are most afraid of not knowing what's going to happen next in their situation. And they develop a very heightened sense of hypervigilance. And that hypervigilance has been what has kept them safe. And to cope with that hypervigilance and with a stalking, some individuals move towards the perpetrator, some move away from the perpetrator, some move against the perpetrator, they try to get a civil protection order, etc. But when victims are moving towards the offender, that's always the piece that people get a little curious about. And what happens sometimes is victims engage with the stalker as a safety strategy. And while we want to recommend that victims of stalking disengage with the offender, especially in intimate partner situations, that's really hard. If they share kids in common, if they have mutual family, etc., it's very difficult to completely disengage. And so some individuals might actually engage with the offender to do a temperature check. If you're working with somebody and they're a stalking victim and they say, I've been being stalked on a daily basis, and I actually haven't heard from the stalker in the last 3 days, nobody thinks, oh, great, that means the stalking case is over. Everybody's, what do you mean you haven't heard from them in 3 days? What are they thinking? What are they planning? Oh, and victims are thinking the same thing. And so they may be maintaining contact because they are doing so as a safety strategy. While disengagement is ideal, it's not very practical and it's not very realistic. So keeping that in mind in these particular situations. As we're safety planning with victims, then remembering that it involves all the components that you see on the screen in front of you, that we have to think about advocating and documenting. And one of the things that oftentimes happens in stalking cases is people have a tendency to safety plan around the physical things. They'll tell victims of stalking to get a dog or buy a Ring camera. And there isn't as much emphasis put on the emotional well-being, which is critical to supporting victims and for their continued participation in the criminal justice process. We have to be supporting them emotionally, talking about what resources are available, where to find additional support, et cetera, as a way of supporting individuals in these particular situations. What we have to remember is that our safety planning has to evolve and that the stalker is going to constantly be changing their tactics, and we have to anticipate what their reaction might be to victims' safety strategies. For example, a lot of people will tell victims of stalking, change your phone number. Do we really think that if a victim of stalking changes their phone number, that the stalker would just give up stalking them? No, they're going to show up at the victim's work, where they live, etc. And now we have just escalated things from phone contact to in-person contact. And from a safety strategy, not the best idea. Consider when you're safety planning with victims that simply unplugging or logging off is not always the best safety strategy. It oftentimes will escalate things and put the victim in increased danger. The other thing that we have to consider is that in a lot of these cases, victims are essentially asked to provide a lot of the evidence that are needed in these cases. And one of the things that can be extremely helpful is for victims to keep a documentation log. Now, we have this available, and Emma just linked it in English and in Spanish on our website. On one side of it has the log. On the other side has instructions to victims on how to keep the log. And they log the description of the incident and where it happened, which can help us figure out jurisdiction. Did it happen in the city? And so the police might have a report, or was it out in the county? And so the sheriffs might have a report. So this particular incident log can be extremely helpful in these situations. And again, it's available and linked for you by Emma on our website. The other thing we want you to be thinking about, especially as many of you are working together to coordinate the responses to domestic violence in your community, is how can you fold in the response to stalking? And one of the things that we would suggest is consider using something like the SHARP assessment to focus on risk and to really make sure that you're involving all pieces of the system, including probation, corrections, pretrial monitoring, both systems-based advocates and community-based advocates, and also realizing that part of the strategy has to be ensuring that each of your individual agencies has policies and procedures on working with stalking victims. And are people in your agency receiving training on stalking? You were able to attend today, but are there other people that could have benefited from this particular training today? How are you sharing that information? We actually have a button on our website that you can request a training from Spark. If you are a current or potential grantee from the Office on Violence Against Women, we can provide training to you free of charge. If you're involved in the system in any way, chances are you're considered a potential grantee, and we could provide that training to you. So please check that out. We do both virtual and in-person trainings. And then I want to highlight a couple of resources for all of you, depending on which particular profession you're a part of. So we have resources for law enforcement on how do you identify stalking on calls for service. It's under our law enforcement section. Resources on writing investigations and reports on stalking. For prosecutors, Spark is part of Equitas, which is the prosecutor's resource on violence against women. And so there's lots of really great resources on Equitas's website. We have a prosecutor's guide to prosecuting stalking on Spark's website. And then we have judicial resources. So resources for judges on here as well. And then, of course, for all of you who are advocates, so guides for advocates as well. Emma just linked the request a training button on there. So on our website, it says training, and then one of the pull downs just says request a training, and you can request a training on the website. Please keep in mind, if you request a training for next week, probably not going to happen. We're booking out a couple of months in advance, so please be flexible with us. The last thing I want to call your attention to is I hope that Peggy's story had an impact on you. And as part of what her sister did to raise awareness after Peggy's death was she went to Congress and petitioned for Congress to pay more attention to stalking. And they passed a resolution for Stalking Awareness Month to be created in the month of January. It's held in January because Peggy was killed on January 18th. So every year, Spark is responsible for training and awareness around the issue of stalking, and we are in charge of Stalking Awareness Month in the month of January. So one of the things that we're doing this year is the 20th anniversary of Stalking Awareness Month. And so we are asking for a call to action, a day of action on January 18th. One of the things that Peggy's sister said about Peggy's situation was that as she was involved in that situation, as Patrick was stalking Peggy, that they noticed Peggy's sparkle just disappear. And so together with Debbie and in honor of Peggy, we are calling for a day of action on the 18th of January in 2024. And we invite you to spark a dialogue and wear something sparkly or shiny and then take a picture as part of our day of action. So we're going to be doing a very large social media campaign. We can't do it without all of you. So please consider participating in that particular effort. This again is our website, and I've noticed a bunch of you have already asked about certificates of attendance. And please take this with the kindness that I'm about to express to you. There are over, at one point, 260 of you on this webinar. There is one person in our office who's responsible for certificates. So unless you absolutely have to have a certificate, please don't request one. If you absolutely have to have one, you can send an email to Emma and she's going to link her email in the chat for you. What we would ask is please be patient with us. We do webinars like this all the time. There's typically 200 to 300 people on each webinar and one person to do all the certificates, and that's an eighth of a job. So please be patient if you request a certificate. I know people that attended earlier this month already asked for a certificate, and that's fine, but just know that it will be a little while before we can respond to you. So again, unless you absolutely need one, please be kind to us and the efforts that we have in our office. Please don't email TA to TA, the hosts of this webinar, because they will not be providing information to you. You would need to email Emma directly, and Emma will put her information in the chat here for you, again, to request a certificate. And then Emma, have you had a chance to link the PDF of the PowerPoint? If not, I can bring it up again.
Not yet. I'm going to put my email in the chat and then the slides.
Thank you. And huge thank you to both our Spanish interpreters and our ASL interpreters, and of course to TA for hosting the webinar today. We will make a recording of this and it will be put up on our website. It usually takes us about 3 to 4 weeks to get the recording back and to get it posted on the website. So look for it within the next month or so. And again, Emma will put a copy of the slides and her email in the chat that you can all reach out to us if you would need so. And with that, we are going to close it down, and we're going to leave the chat up for just a second so Emma can link her information. And then again, the recording will be on in about another month. Thank you all for your time and for your attention. We appreciate you and everything that you're doing for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we encourage you to think about doing something for January on the Day of Action. Thank you all very much.